This podcast contains descriptions of violence against children and adult language and is not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hi everyone, and welcome to Suffer the Little Children, the true crime podcast giving voices back to the victims of child abuse and shining a harsh spotlight on the parents, guardians, and caretakers who silence them. I'm your host, Lane, and this is episode 134, Investigating Medical Child Abuse. My guest on the podcast today is highly esteemed Tarrant County Sheriff's Investigator Michael Weber, who specializes in investigating cases of medical child abuse, also known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Detective Weber is also a member of the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children's Munchausen by Proxy Committee, alongside international expert on factitious disorders Dr. Marc Feldman and author Andrea Dunlop. Detective Weber is also a Munchausen by proxy investigative expert, law enforcement trainer, and consultant on these complicated cases, which are notoriously difficult to prosecute. I'm honored to have the opportunity to talk with him about his work and how important it is to raise awareness of this lesser-known but surprisingly common form of child abuse. This is episode 134, Investigating Medical Child Abuse. I'd like to take a moment to thank my newest patrons, Amanda L., J.M., and Leah T., all hailing from the cabinet under the stairs. Thank you all for your support, which helps me to keep this podcast going. As I've said many times before, by making this show, I'm not looking for fortune or fame. All I aspire to do is keep telling these kids' stories and continue raising awareness about the signs of child abuse, things we can watch out for, and other important and rarely talked about topics. I don't want to make $1 gazillion doing this. My goal is just to be able to support myself and my kids while devoting myself full-time to the podcast. Every month, I'm getting closer to that goal. So thank you to all of my patrons and to all of my listeners who put up with ads throughout my episodes. You're all the reason I'm still able to produce this show, and I appreciate you with all my heart. If you'd like to support the show by making a monthly pledge, you can visit patreon.com/stlcpod. Thank you again, and I love you all. Before we get into the episode, I'm proud to present this trailer for Andrea Dunlop's excellent podcast, Nobody Should Believe Me, which is a deep dive into the notorious medical child abuse case of Hope Ibarra, and much more.
It's the thing that split my family apart. And I find myself still trying to make sense of memories that don't make any sense. I'm Andrea Dunlop, host of Nobody Should Believe Me, a new podcast exploring Munchausen by proxy, a form of medical child abuse where a parent fabricates, exaggerates, or induces illness in their child. I explore the story of Hope Ibarra, a mom of 3 from Texas who was convicted of medical child abuse and spent 10 years in prison.
She was so trustworthy and so dependable, in her everyday life. She worked, she took care of her kids. You could rely on her. Why would we not rely on her to tell us the truth?
This involves a medical environment, and it involves children in most cases, and it is irrefutably a form of abuse.
I really wanted to meet Hope because she was the only person who could give me the answers I was looking for.
She was my baby girl, and I have so much regret for hurting her. I love my family, especially my children, more than anything on this planet, regardless of what I've done and the choices that I've made.
One of the things I've really wrestled with in this podcast is this hope that I'll do this and that she'll hear it and say, I'm exhausted, I want to come home. help me come home. Listen on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
I highly recommend listening to Nobody Should Believe Me, which is a great source of information and education about medical child abuse. Andrea did a spectacular job with it. On that note, here's my conversation with another rock star in the medical child abuse community, Tarrant County Sheriff's Investigator Michael Weber. My guest today on the podcast is Tarrant County Sheriff's Investigator Michael Weber. Thank you so much for joining me today, Mike.
Thank you for having me.
Can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Mike Weber. I am an investigator with the Tarrant County Sheriff's Office in Fort Worth, Texas. I'm a 38-year police veteran, done 15 years investigating crimes against children, and I have developed a specialty in medical child abuse, or Munchausen by proxy. Not by my choice, more of just happenstance that occurred.
How did that kind of come about? Were you investigating other types of child abuse cases?
I retired from a local police department and gone to a DA's office to be a DA investigator, which is a second position kind of helping attorneys develop cases for trial. Shortly after I got into that position, my chief attorney came to me and they have a medical child abuse case that had jurisdictional issues. And she's like, will you handle it? I'm like, sure. I worked that one terribly because I didn't know what I was doing and there was no template. We forwarded that. All of the surgeries, which are the injuries normally in these cases, happened out of state, so we forwarded that to the out-of-state jurisdiction where those things occurred. And I just went to my chief attorney and like, look, these take a lot of time. It's going to be hard for someone with a bunch of cases on their caseload to do these. Why don't you give me these if they come in the future? And she's like, well, that's fine. I've been here 8 years. This is the only one we've had. That was in the winter or January of 2010. And I believe got the Hope Ybarra case right after that. And from 2010 to 2015, I investigated 16 reports of this abuse in Tarrant County, and we filed criminal cases on 6 individuals, 5 guilty pleas for child abuse crimes and 1 guilty plea to Medicaid fraud. In 2015, there was a new DA who came in whose focus was not on this and did not want us working this. And so I stopped working them to 2018 when I went to the sheriff's office in the same county, Tarrant County, which is Fort Worth, Texas. And from that point, from December 2018 until currently, I've investigated, I don't even know how many reports of this abuse, easily over 30. Arrested 9 separate offenders for this abuse in Tarrant County. And I think we have guilty pleas on at least 3 or 4 of those cases currently. Well, I have 4 pending, so I guess we have guilty pleas on 5.
So just in Tarrant County, 9 in the past few years. So it's not nearly as rare as people think it is.
No, not at all. What I say is this abuse isn't rare. It's just rarely investigated properly, if investigated at all, and very rarely prosecuted.
Yes, I can imagine there's a lot of challenges in doing that. And since you have kind of a unique position in having investigated for the police department, the DA's office, and the sheriff's office, you probably have seen a lot of different sides of these cases.
Yeah, and actually being at the DA's office really, when you get to see the criminal trial side of it all the way through, it really increases your knowledge on what you need to do on the front end, right? When you are an active police detective, which is at the sheriff's office. That's what I am. I'm an active police detective.
So what would you say are the challenges in prosecuting these cases, the biggest challenges?
Really, the biggest challenges is education. Educating the attorneys that this is a crime, how to prosecute this. Educating CPS. In my state, CPS has no policies on this abuse. And it's not just my state, which is Texas, right? I think there's 2 states, Arizona and Arkansas, who actually have written CPS policies on how to handle a medical child abuse case, which is a very, very, very different investigation than anything that CPS handles otherwise. I don't know if we're going alphabetically, but those are the only 2 states currently that have any written policies in their CPS policies for this abuse. And CPS investigators in my state receive no mandated training on this abuse. They may get some training if they go to one of my presentations or see something at a child abuse conference. But other than that, they don't have any training on this. So a lot of times they don't even notify police that this abuse is occurring, because they don't necessarily see it as abuse. And even if they do notify police, I can't tell you the amount of times that I've had CPS investigators tell me that they notify police and police were like, well, this is a CPS issue. This isn't a crime. Well, it's a crime if certain things are done to the child. I mean, it has to meet our current criminal laws in the state of Texas. But if they've had a surgery done, it meets those criminal laws. That unneeded surgery, I should say.
That makes sense. And I know you had mentioned that you're working on another law coming up in Texas legislature to make false medical history reporting a crime.
Yes, we are. And it would be the first law specific to this abuse in the United States if we can get it passed. We've been to the legislature twice before. While Texas is a very law and order state, Texas is also a very family first state. And again, you also have the education process that you have to do with the legislatures who don't understand this and have little time to take to understand this. So you're trying to shoehorn, 3 hours of information into a 5-minute conversation when you get the chance.
That must be an overwhelming burden to try to do that.
It is not easy. We have some legislatures who understand that this is a problem. We have the bill sponsor going forward on this abuse, and we've educated as many legislatures as we could in Tarrant County. But again, it's the state legislature, right? So they're from all over Texas, and we can't get to a lot of those people.
Sure. It seems like education is definitely an issue, regardless of what agency you're looking at, whether it's CPS or law enforcement or the prosecuting attorneys. And it must just be a huge mountain to overcome.
The standard line I use is, this abuse is about where sexual abuse was in the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
In the 60s, everyone thought it, if they even thought about sexual abuse at all, it was, the creepy guy in the van stealing kids off the street. And what we know now is it's more likely to be a family member or close. Mm-hmm. So we're really, really fighting that bad perception. And then we're also fighting, the society's perception of motherhood. It's really hard for a lot of people to wrap their head around a mother would willfully do this to the child. Now, the point is, this is willful abuse. It has many commonalities with pedophilia. It is a psychological issue, exactly like pedophilia. Pedophilia has been in the DSM since 1952. This abuse has been in the DSM since 2013. Even though pedophilia is a mental illness diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness, we don't treat it like that in court. We investigate it and we prosecute those offenders because the legal standard for sanity is you know what you're doing and you know what's wrong when you're doing it. And these offenders, through their long pattern of deceit, demonstrate that very, very easily.
It seems that they are very well aware of what they're doing and why they're doing it. It seems that attention is a big part of that.
Yeah, something intrinsic, right? Attention, love, whatever intrinsic thing that they're not feeling is getting fulfilled. And I know from interviewing these offenders, they really present in an interview room no different than an offender in a child sex abuse case or an offender in a child physical abuse case. They will lie initially. You'll hit them with some facts they don't know you have. They'll then change their story to try to get around those facts. You may end up getting admissions, but you never get the full version of the truth. And that is every child sexual abuse offender interview I've been in. That is every physical abuse interview I've been in, and that is every single one of these offenders interviews that I've been in. They really present no differently than any other child abuse offender.
And then in the end, they may give you the story that makes them sound the least guilty or the least culpable or sound best.
Correct. Now, the good thing about these offenders is they're not hardened criminals usually. Most of them don't have a criminal history. They're very used to being believed, which makes them very susceptible to a professional police interview. As far as us maybe getting some admissions from them. I know it's in literature that they'll never admit. I don't believe that. I've gotten admissions from several of them, and what I consider as close to a true confession as I'll ever get from one of them. Just to point out, those admissions always came after first denying, which shows a consciousness of guilt.
They definitely cover their tracks, or try to at least. So once you started investigating these, what did you notice that these offenders had in common?
Well, some of the commonalities that just with pedophilia is, the manipulation of adults around the child. With pedophiles, it's to get sexual access to the child. With these offenders, they manipulate the medical community to abuse the child. They'll manipulate family court to give them the child back to continue having access with the child. And they're very good at manipulating family court. The victims love their offenders, right? Mm-hmm. The victims in this love their offenders. That's another commonality with pedophilia. Normally in most cases of pedophilia, it's not a stranger. It's someone that the victim knows and loves and has trust with. And the manipulation of the victim is also a part of this. The grooming of the victim is very similar to pedophilia, especially as the victim gets older. The victim actually becomes a participant in the abuse. In this abuse, the victim learns to get love by playing the sick role, which makes it extremely hard when you get differentiating what's abuse and what's self-harm whenever you get to the teenage years, once they've been doing this for so long. These offenders have a lot in common with pedophilia. This abuse has a lot in common with pedophilia, just from the manipulation aspect. There's also no bond with the child in this abuse. What we've seen, if we can get the child separated, is, I remember I had one 3-year-old victim. Normally when you separate the mom from the child is obviously distressed. This 3-year-old was telling the CPS worker the next day, I don't need my mommy anymore. Not a typical reaction you get from a 3-year-old. They just don't have the normal mother-child bond with the victims. Some kids, that's the norm. That's all they know. So when you grow up with that as a child, when you're told you're sick your whole life, you believe you're sick. The Gypsy Blanchard case is out in pop culture currently. That case, she was 22 and still in a wheelchair. So it can go on for years and years and years if not caught, because that's all they know. That's what they're taught. That's how they get love.
I'll take a moment now for a word from my sponsors. Who do you find reports these cases most often? Is it doctors? Is it family members?
It's most often comes from the medical field. Our doctors in Tarrant County at our children's hospital, Cook's Children's Hospital, are more educated, I think, than most doctors are at other children's hospitals. And Cook's has dedicated some resources specifically toward this abuse that other hospitals have not. And you have to understand, in order for me to have an effective criminal investigation, I need a full medical record review of the victim's medical records, all of them from birth full, a full medical record review. I need all of that dumped into a spreadsheet, sorted by date. And to do that, I had a 3-year-old that had 18,000 pages of medical records. And you have to go through each history, because what you're looking for is mom lying to the doctors in the history. And you're also looking for negative medical tests or positive medical tests, right? Because doing this investigation the right way, you not only catch these offenders, but you clear false reports. And, sometimes the person who was reported never even has to know. You never even have to bring that up to them, because you have a system in place that says, no, this isn't what it is. This child really has an issue.
Do you find that there are a lot of similarities between the cases of medical child abuse, where it's a particular illness or type of illness or the personality traits of the perpetrators?
It can be done in any variety of ways. But we do see certain procedures. I mean, gastric feeding tubes, like the first 6 cases I had of this abuse was a gastric feeding tube placement. Wow. And the reason for that, I used to joke that these offenders have a playbook. These offenders look for diagnoses that are hard to medically test for. So this is why we see the same things happening over and over again, because it's the path of least resistance to get medical procedures done. Most of these are by history. Gastric issues, well, the doctor's not going to go home with the child and see if the child's throwing up, and they're going to trust that history by mom. Mm-hmm. And that's what they're trained to do. So this does not take a sophisticated offender at all. This is very easy form of abuse to commit. And, if you want to do this in 1992 or 1993 and you had no medical knowledge, I mean, you'd have to put some work into it, right? Mm-hmm. You'd have to go to the library. You'd have to look things up. Now it's a Google search. And then for attention, which is the reward, back in 92, 93, it was thought that they wanted this attention from doctors or from medical professionals. That attention field has now broadened so much with social media. Mm-hmm. You will see these offenders, normally their Facebook pages are public. They're always posting about the health of their child. They'll have all sorts of, I've seen epilepsy, National Epilepsy Day, because they're presenting their child as being epileptic, but their child isn't. You see that all over their social media. So that provides that attention satisfaction. And, there are groups online, epilepsy groups, there's gastro groups, there's all sorts of groups they can go to for support to get, if you're an offender and you're doing this to your child, you can get that attention fix from those groups because they're there for support and they're going to support you.
I've seen multiple offenders who had blogs where they could just talk as much as they wanted. And didn't Hope Ibarra have a blog at some point?
Hope did. Interestingly enough, her blog was mainly about her own, because she was falsifying illness in herself also. It was mainly about her own cancer. And just so people understand how convincing these offenders can be, Hope's entire family was fooled. And they are decent, hardworking people. And they know her better than anyone. And she fooled them. This is not hard to commit. If she can fool them, think about it, how easy it would be to fool a doctor you see for 15 minutes.
Especially if they're doctor shopping and spending time at different practices and hospitals. And
there's several ways to commit this, right? You can either commit it by exaggerating, falsifying, or inducing symptoms in the child. And that's not a step ladder. Those aren't steps that these offenders take. They can be anywhere on that spectrum or doing all of it at the same time. And with Hope, that was the case. She was not only falsifying, but also inducing illness in her child. She had taken pathogens from a lab she worked at. She was a lab director at a food testing company, and she had placed the pathogens into the victim through a nebulizer treatment. Interestingly enough, she took a pathogen that was a pneumonia, that was a form of pneumonia that is common in cystic fibrosis patients. So she was basically inducing a symptom of cystic fibrosis in the victim.
That one seems like a common illness that they want to inflict or at least make it look like their child has with the salt tests and all of those sorts of things.
Yeah, well, and again, it's easy to do, right? Just like Hope says in my interview with her, you just spray a little nose spray underneath the patch, because a presumptive for cystic fibrosis is the sweat test. You just put a cotton patch on a child's arm, let me go play with mom for 30 minutes, and come back and you test the sweat collected in that patch. And if the content of salt is over a certain amount in the sweat, you're presumptive positive. That's what Hope did. And she admitted to altering that test.
Hers is a very unusual case in that she's willing to admit all of this.
Correct. Well, and, I had a lot of things that in her interview that I could confront her with. And she lied to me for the first hour of that. And I let her lie because I knew I had things that I could confront her with. And I wanted to have her full story before I confronted her, which led to admissions. Again, they are not skilled criminals.
Mm-hmm.
They are used to being believed. And if investigators use that to their advantage, they can elicit at least admissions from these offenders. Obviously, not all of them. Some people are going to deny to the end of time. It's just human nature in some people. But the literature and the experts that I've heard say that these offenders will never confess, that's not necessarily true. You can get admissions from them. Maybe not a full confession, but you can get admissions in a professional police interview if you've done the work, if you have the material to confront them with.
But I think that's why Hope's case is so fascinating. Andrea covered it very well in Nobody Should Believe Me. It's very comprehensive, and I love the way she interwove it with her own experience as well.
I just hope you make me sound as smart as they make me sound.
No problem. I'll pause here for another quick sponsor break.
Well, and another point I want to bring up about, the frequency of cases, not just here in Tarrant County, but if you look at a recent paper published out of Seattle Children's, one of the authors of that paper is Dr. Carol Jenny. If you look at that paper over a 4-year period, now they went back and looked at this over time, right? So they are doing a review of 4 years in the early 2010s. When they did the review of those 4 years, they found 65 cases of this abuse that they could confirm just by medical record review. That's like with no outside police investigation, which can provide so much more evidence. But they found 65 cases they could confirm with medical record review, another 30 some odd that they were unsure about. That certainly a police investigation could have helped. I asked Dr. Jenny if she remembered how many of those had police investigations, and she said maybe one.
Oh.
And again, they're reviewing, so I don't know how many of those were reported at the time. I imagine probably not that many. And how many actually made it to police through CPS to police, I don't know. The interesting thing about that number is they looked at the number of abusive head trauma cases during the same time period. And it was the medical child abuse cases were 2/3 of the amount of the abusive head trauma cases during the same time period. And we certainly wouldn't ignore that many abusive head trauma cases, but we ignore these all the time.
It doesn't sound like there's something in the water either. Even if they're focusing on it in that one particular area, it's not because it's all happening there. We're just not seeing it being detected across state lines.
Right. Trust me, I have 55 cases on my caseload. I am not out looking for these cases. Trust me. So they come to me. We've developed a system. It is far from perfect. It needs, a lot more resources devoted to it because a lot of us in this system are a bit overwhelmed. Mm-hmm. But, we're able to catch at least the most serious of these cases. And then we've even caught some where we could stop them, beforehand. I think Kelly Flanagan is one case. We managed to stop her at getting an NG tube, which is nasal gastric tube, so through the nose into the stomach. And, we were able to stop her at that level. And that is a crime that causes physical pain, which is injury to a child, bodily injury in the state of Texas.
Oh, good. Yeah, that's got to be the goal, is to stop it before it happens to the degree where the child is either permanently disfigured or killed.
Correct. And, it's also important to point out there's a 6 to 9% mortality rate in this abuse, which makes it, if not the most, one of the most deadly forms of child abuse.
Right. I was going to ask you about that, the number there. So 6 to 9% mortality rate. That's terrifying.
Those are studies by Rosenberg and Sheridan. Sheridan's had over 400 cases. Rosenberg's only had about 100 and some odd that they looked at.
Unbelievable. And still the surviving victims, I should say, have a hard time getting people to believe them.
Oh, sure. It's manipulation to the highest point. And it is much easier to dismiss the person whose story sounds crazy. Or for prosecutors, it's much easier to just dismiss me, right? Oh, well, that guy's overzealous. That's the easy way out. Instead of having to do a lot of work on a hard case for a prosecutor, a very little reward. They're not going to get a big sentence on these if the kid's still alive. Not in the current environment. Any jail time is a miracle in these cases if the kid's still living. All bets are off if the kid is dead.
That all depends on the jurisdiction, I would imagine.
Yeah, and the method of death and, strength of the evidence.
Do you think that a lot of these perpetrators intend ultimately to kill the child, or that they just don't care if that happens, or what do you think the intent is there?
Well, and again, that's very much a case-by-case basis, right? That depends on the individual perpetrator. But I can say, like with Hope, she had presented her daughter as being terminally ill with cystic fibrosis. At some point, she's either going to have a miracle recovery from a genetic disease that no one recovers from, or she's going to have to die.
Yeah, that's scary. It makes you wonder what's going on. I wonder, do you see or suspect any kind of overlap in these perpetrators with personality disorders like narcissistic or borderline?
The most common, from what I understand from Dr. Marc Feldman, the most common psych diagnosis in these offenders, besides factitious disorder imposed on another, is a personality disorder. Most commonly borderline or narcissistic personality disorder.
It's pretty terrifying that anyone is capable of treating another person that way, let alone their own child in most cases.
Well, and let's take it a step further, right? So we identify these offenders. We know they have the most common comorbidity is personality disorder. Personality disorders, they require lifelong treatment, right?
Yeah, no medication either, just therapy and hope for the best.
Right, and lifelong. And here in my state, and I'm sure in other states, CPS does not stay involved in the child's life the entirety.
No.
So when they give the child back, they're not monitoring that mom.
And that's the problem, is giving them back in the first place. The need for reunification by CPS in almost every state is kind of the scary part.
It is the stated goal in the state of Texas and almost every other state is family reunification. And there's a lot of reasons for that I understand. The foster care system is not the best. But in these cases, you could be subjecting that child to a childhood of torture. I mean, it is physical abuse, it is emotional abuse, it is psychological abuse, all of them. And that child is going to experience it until the mother can no longer control that child.
Right, or until the child, unfortunately, doesn't make it.
Correct. And, they're not doctors, right? So especially if they start inducing things, they may not get it right. one of the scariest forms of this abuse is whenever there are apnea reports and there's actually apnea seen. That cannot be medically explained, right? That there's no medical cause for, because that is extremely concerning for suffocation.
And there's no guarantee that CPR is going to bring that child back. No,
there's not. And, we had a suffocation case at Cook's Children's that I worked, and that offender did get 12 years. But it was a difficult suffocation case just because the manner she did it was clutching the child to her, basically putting the child in her bosom and smothering the child by squeezing his face into her bosom.
And he was young, right? Was that the 7-month-old?
Yes.
Yeah, it's going to be kids who are too little to say anything or report what's happening to them.
And, suffocation leaves very few physical markers on children.
Right.
On infants, I should say.
That's got to be one that's very, very hard to track.
When you see those concerns in these cases, when you see suffocation concerns in these cases, and there's actual documented medical events, it's extremely concerning. What I can say is it's extremely important to have someone that can do medical record review on these cases. That, you have that person that can spend 2 weeks on one case. There's 2 child abuse pediatricians at Cook's Children's for a ton of patients. Cook's Children's services Tarrant County, which is 2 million. And then outlying counties to the north, south, and west, right? Okay. So Cook's Children's is servicing probably in the area of 2.5 million people. And so you can imagine that the child abuse pediatricians there are extremely busy. So they need those extra resources to be able to do that medical record review, which they have now for a while.
That was a question I wanted to ask you. You had mentioned social media earlier and how it does play into the investigations. Do you think it makes it easier to investigate and prosecute now that social media, they're just blurting out their business everywhere?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, you have, again, if you do the investigation properly, CPS in my county, they don't always do it, but they are supposed to contact me on one of these cases first before they do anything, before they contact mom. I can tell you that on one of these cases, the reason that we do it this way, I can preserve social media records. I don't need a warrant to preserve them. I can either send a letter. A lot of the companies have online portals where you can just, copy the web link to the page and put it in there and preserve it for 90 days. I don't know about others, but I know Facebook does not save anything. So you have to have that preservation in before that first interview with the offender. The offender could go back and erase her account, right? And very interestingly enough, in one of my cases, actually my sheriff's daughter's case, he adopted her after the abuse.
Oh, wow.
I wasn't working for him at the time. I was working at the DA's office, and he was a local police. But in that case, we did everything. The CPS worker contacted me. I preserved the account. And she's going to meet with her. I'm like, hey, just ask her what her name is on her Facebook account, just so I can verify this account. That's all I was thinking. I just wanted her to tell the worker that, right? And the worker was used to doing these cases, and the first interview is always non-confrontational, information gathering only. It came in as medical neglect, so they're going to tell you how they're not medically neglecting their kid, just the opposite, right? And so she very much downplayed it. Never told her that it was a Munchausen, never mentioned Munchausen by proxy, nothing about, that mom was accused of, getting unneeded treatments in the child. And that mom was actually inducing symptoms. But when I ended up getting a search warrant for that offender's laptop computer, when we looked at her internet search history, the day of that interview with the CPS worker, you know what she Googled? How to delete Facebook. It's a consciousness of guilt. She's deleting it because she knows there's criminal evidence on Facebook and she wants it gone, which is why it's so important to get in and find their social media and preserve it. And text messages with friends are important because if the allegation is a false medical history and they're texting their friends about the health of the child and there are lies in those text messages, now you have probable cause for all of their computer equipment, right? Yeah. Because your phone connects to your laptop, downloads to your laptop, saves all your text messages to your laptop, whether you know it or not. You can get into all of their stuff. And, that's how we actually ended up trying that offender, which, her name was Brittany Phillips.
Okay.
And we also found during that hospitalization when her child had a polymicrobial blood infection, 3 organisms in the blood, that caused infection. We ended up finding that right before that happened, she had Googled an article about a lady that was caught on video camera in Austin, Texas, putting feces into her child's IV line and feeding tube. And then right after that, she started Googling poo in veins, pee in blood, poop in stomach.
Unreal.
But again, the pattern, right? I mean, you see that
Mhm.
in a lot of them. And she actually Googled that article and followed that pattern. So it was very much a copycat.
Yeah, that's disturbing.
Because of the way we communicate, how it's changed over the years, it's really laid out a lot of good evidence avenues for police officers if they choose to take them.
So you do a lot of educating other law enforcement agencies on this particular topic.
I do. I'm actually presenting at the National Child Advocacy Center 39th Annual Symposium on Child Abuse in Huntsville, Alabama next month in March.
Oh, that's
on
awesome.
This topic.
Okay.
With my
great.
child abuse pediatrician, Jamie Kaufman.
Great.
But there's lazy people in every profession. And, cops are not immune to that. And, neither are prosecutors. And it really takes a focused effort to get these cases to trial.
So it's going to depend on the very individual circumstances,
The
down to
individual circumstances and the individuals handling those circumstances. Absolutely.
Exactly. One thing I don't understand is how people don't seem to grasp how intensive investigations into these sort of things, or really any crime, are, in that you have to get the probable cause to search into certain things, and it takes time to build that investigation. I can't imagine it's hardly ever an immediate arrest if you don't catch the person in the act.
That's exactly correct. I mean, we had some where we've caught them in the act, but if you don't, you're looking at easily a 6-month investigation.
Sure.
Let's say it's a falsification case where all mom is doing is lying about medical history of the child to get a feeding tube. You're looking at easily a 6-month investigation. I had a case recently. I spent 2.5 months only on that case. That is on that case, only on that case, 2.5 months solid, 40 hours a week for 2.5 months on that case. And currently, we're hoping to change this year. We're doing a training for our family court bar in Tarrant County. But currently, family court CPS attorneys do not understand the seriousness of this abuse. And so I have to work these cases before anything else because there's no safety net for these kids. And I understand they have to deal with family court judges who don't understand this abuse also. Mm-hmm. But again, we're starting to make progress. I've been trying to get in front of our family court bar for 3 years, and we finally have accomplished that. We'll do that in March.
That's excellent. I mean, this is such a huge undertaking, and you're doing such great work. It's so important. I just give you a lot of credit for doing that. It's incredible, and I thank you for bringing attention to it.
Yeah, it's like beating your head against a wall some days. But thank you.
Oh, it's got to be frustrating most of the time. How did you end up on the AppSec MVP committee?
When I first started doing these cases, again, there's no template. I had no resources. So, of course, I went to the internet, and the one true expert I could find that I could verify he was an expert was Dr. Marc Feldman. And I reached out to Dr. Feldman. He's been definitely a mentor for me. Between him and Dr. Jamie Kaufman at Cook's Children's, they let me know, this is abuse. And it made sense to me pretty right off the bat what this was. It made sense to me. You go to a doctor, you tell him your arm hurts, the doctor's going to look at your arm. A lot of people don't know, well, why can't they medically test? Well, the doctor's going by what you tell them. And for kids, they're going by what the parent tells them. I reached out to him, and he really kind of led me down the trail of what this was. And I had worked many of these cases. And then in 2015, a Fort Worth reporter named Deanna Boyd did a series. We didn't go to her. She actually was trying to do a series on females who had confessed child abuse crimes. And she ran across Hope Ybarra. And then she found out about all the other cases, and she ended up doing a big series on medical child abuse. And once that got in the paper, Dr. Feldman asked me if I wanted to be on the committee. I said, certainly. It was very much an honor to be asked to be on there. And, it's led to some publishing opportunities that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise as a guy with detective in front of us.
It definitely gives you a platform as well to get the word out on this, because raising awareness has to be such a big part of it.
Right. And, being peer review published a couple of times and being on this committee, it's also not as easy to just dismiss me as overly aggressive. And having a bunch of criminal convictions on this also. It's become harder for the people who want to do that. And I think doing that has kind of forced my county to look at this more dead in the eye, I think, than other counties.
That's awesome. It seems like such a niche thing, but it's really not. It's so important that it actually does happen more widely across the country.
And, in the time I've been at the Tarrant County Sheriff's Office, like I said, 9 offenders since 2018. I kind of keep track through Google Alert of any other cases. these cases are going to make media because they're still very weird to the public. They'll at least make local media. They'll come through in a Google alert. And there has not been one other case in any major county in the state of Texas since 2018. And I found mine. It's not just happening in my county.
No.
And, I've talked to child abuse pediatricians at other hospitals, and they just cannot get their police interested in working this.
It's so frustrating. But yeah, I guess it is, like you said, there's going to be people who are more ambitious and people who are, let's say, less ambitious about it. And if only they could really understand what this does to these children.
Right.
Now for one final sponsor break. That was another question I wanted to ask you is, do you think there's enough support for survivors of this type of abuse?
Until recently, there was none. Thankfully, Andrea Dunlop has started a 501c3 to kind of help deal with this. I would get 2 or 3 calls a week, and I had no place to send these people, and obviously they want to talk to someone who understands it. But thankfully now I can refer them to Andrea, and she has survivor groups. She has fathers groups, which I think is very important because, these fathers are, if they do end up suspecting this, they are routinely treated terribly by family court. They just think dad's, trying to get out of child support or trying to do this, trying to do that. And they have no understanding for this abuse. Interestingly enough, in the Family Court Journal, there have been 2 articles published on this abuse, and both of those articles were in the early 90s. So they just don't have a knowledge base for this at all.
Thank goodness Andrea did that. And it's munchausensupport.com. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. I know, since I did my series on Munchausen back in 2021, and especially now after I covered the Kenzia case in the mini series that I did at the end of last year, I've gotten many emails from people who want their story told and who want more information and want to know who to contact. And that's been a challenge for me to try to figure out where to send them. So knowing about Andrea's group is wonderful. And I know she had mentioned that when I talked to her in 2021 that they were trying to get that going. I just didn't realize when it actually was up and running. So I'm glad to be able to share that now.
Surely. Well, and I'm a terrible businessman, but I guess I should do a little plug for myself too.
Definitely. So you have your consulting website.
Yes. MikeWeberConsulting.com. It's mainly a training website. I'm not really taking on a lot of medical record review because I have just too much work at regular work and I need to keep my sanity. But I do training for police. I do training for CPS, for anyone in childcare. I've done a training for a legal nurse convention. Anyone that has a connection to this form of abuse. And I tailor the trainings to whatever group that I'm speaking with.
That's great. And so as far as that goes, if someone needs to talk to someone about something that they believe was medical child abuse and no one is listening to them, what do they do or where should they go?
I always, especially if they're reporting a current crime or something within the last several years, I always encourage them to report to both CPS and the police.
Okay.
You're reporting to both and hoping that one of them understand it. As far as adults who, they're past the statute of limitations or anything like that, the only place I have to send them is to Andrea's group. There are no other resources out there.
Right.
We throw millions. And look, I understand it's a problem. I have friends who work in human trafficking unit. Mm-hmm. I know the situation, but they have millions upon millions upon millions of dollars thrown their way. This has nothing.
Yeah, it's odd how these types of things are prioritized.
And it's just from a lack of understanding. When you don't even understand that there is a need for funding, how are you ever going to get funding?
Yeah, that's going to take a lot of work to get to that point.
Well, just like child sexual abuse started to be better recognized in the 70s, I think we're maybe getting there, with the Gypsy Rose case, with some of the other ones that have been in the news. And I think we're going to see, hopefully as police slowly start to catch on to what this is and start to put time and effort into it, we're going to see a better, more full understanding of this as time goes by. The Olivia Gant case in Colorado has really raised awareness in the Denver area.
Good. Yeah, that poor little girl suffered so much. And the Garnet Spears case in New York State. And, there's a lot of them. But the really frustrating thing is that the words Munchausen by proxy kind of get floated around, but they can't seem to mention it at trial, or they can't use it as anything. It seems like it's putting the spotlight on the wrong parts of the case almost.
Well, and I actually encourage prosecutors that you don't use the term Munchausen by proxy. It's just so misunderstood. If you're going to use the term, you use medical child abuse. Call it what it is.
Okay.
I also tell them, most of these offenders at trial are not going to claim a psych defense. They're not going to try to claim that they didn't know what they were doing at the time. So I tell them, you want to focus on the conduct. Don't focus on a term, because then they're going to relate that term back to mental health issue. Focus on the conduct. Now, there's two parts to trial. So once you get that guilty verdict, you definitely want a mental health professional, someone on our committee that is extremely familiar with this abuse, to testify in the punishment phase of trial. Basically, what they're going to testify to is that these offenders are not crazy. They knew what they did. They knew what they did when it was wrong, and that they're subject to the full weight of the criminal justice system.
That's really good to know, actually.
It's a trial strategy that I have seen work before.
That probably is similar to how the Lacey Spears trial was handled. And
now, that's a very interesting thing in that trial. The prosecution and the defense both wanted to limit out the term Munchausen by proxy. It was never brought up in trial. And then when the judge went to sentence her, he gave her 20 to life instead of 30 to life. And the reason he stated was because it was the worst case of Munchausen by proxy you'd ever seen. He basically gave her a lesser sentence because he thought this was a psych issue.
Yeah.
And that's why you want a psych professional testifying. So your judge or your jury doesn't get confused and think this is a psych issue.
That helps clear that up a lot, actually. I appreciate that. I'm very thankful that you took the time to talk to me and to kind of go into how you investigate these and the importance of getting the word out there and educating all of these different agencies and even the public. Because I think people wouldn't necessarily know what to look for. Like you said, in certain cases, the family is completely fleeced. They have no idea that something's going on. That's the hard part is what can we look for?
Well, yeah, and I'm not a doctor, but I tell you what my child abuse pediatrician told me, and that's for medical professionals. And I think for the public in general, you look for multiple medical diagnoses over multiple body systems that don't make medical sense.
Okay. And probably a lot of putting the information out there on social media or reporting to a lot of different people, almost bragging about what's going on with their child. That might cause some suspicion.
Sure. But, you also have people who just overshare on social media. I'm sure we all have that friend, right?
Oh, for sure.
So, it still takes a complete investigation. I always encourage people, if you suspect, report. And then hopefully the report will be taken seriously and a proper investigation will be done. But that's not your responsibility. Your responsibility is if you suspect abuse, you report abuse. If the other elements fail, that's on them.
But it's definitely on us to be aware of things like this and report them if we suspect them. We can't worry about, I'm going to offend my family member. Well, then you might actually lose the child family member if you don't report it. So it's important that we stay vigilant. Huge thanks to Detective Weber for his dedication to investigating these cases and to educating other agencies on how to detect them. You can learn more about what Mike does at MikeWeberConsulting.com. I'll include the link in today's show notes, along with the links to Dr. Marc Feldman's comprehensive website, Munchausen.com, to Andrea Dunlop's support group website, MunchausenSupport.com, and to Andrea's incredible podcast, Nobody Should Believe Me. That's it for this week. Join me next week for another episode. If you like the show, please follow or subscribe to Suffer the Little Children on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast listening app. And please leave me a 5-star rating and a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. Visit the website at sufferthelittlechildrenpod.com. You can support the show by visiting patreon.com/stlcpod, where you can become a patron for rewards ranging from a shout-out by name on the show to bonus content and exclusive gifts. You can also support the show at ko-fi.com/stlcpod. Follow the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at Suffer the Little Children Pod. and on TikTok at STLCpod. View photos related to today's episode on Facebook. For more stories like the one you heard today, visit sufferthelittlechildrenblog.com. This podcast is researched, written, hosted, edited, and produced by Lane. Intro theme music is by Dream Note Music, and all music for the show is licensed from audiojungle.net. For more information about preventing or reporting child abuse, visit childhelp.org or call your area's child abuse hotline. And remember, if you see something, say something.